On my birthday, my son didn't bring a gift. He brought a verdict. He leaned across the table, his voice low enough that only I could hear, and said, "You're just a retired worker now, that's all." He didn't flinch. He didn't soften it with a smile. And in that instant, something colder than the words themselves settled in my chest, the certainty behind them. It wasn't anger that rose in me first, but disbelief. I had carried steel beams under a summer sun, repaired broken roads in the rain, worked shifts so long my hands forgot how to unclench. I had built a life sturdy enough to hold him, feed him, send him into the world with more than I'd ever had. And here he was, staring me down as if all of that had expired the moment I clocked out for the last time. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. The clinking of silverware around us sounded far away, muffled under the weight of what he'd said. My wife glanced at us, sensing the shift, but he kept eating, as though the conversation was over before it had even begun. I wanted to ask him if he truly believed it, if he thought a man's worth could be measured by whether or not he still wore a uniform, still punched a time card. But the truth was, I already knew the answer. He had grown up in the world I'd worked myself to the bone to give him, and somewhere along the way, he had confused comfort with achievement, position with value. I tried to swallow the bitterness with a sip of coffee, but it stayed on my tongue. Every callus, every scar, every aching joint felt like a testimony now, lined up in my memory, waiting for a court that would never be called. And still, he didn't look at me again, not once. That hurt more than the words. Words can be taken back. Avoidance. That's something you do when you've already closed the door in your mind. And I sat there, in the middle of my own family, realizing I had just been quietly locked out. I let out a sound that was supposed to be a laugh, but it caught halfway, coming out thin and brittle. The table fell still. My wife's fork hovered above her plate, a small piece of bread slipping back onto the porcelain with a soft thud. My grandson's eyes darted toward the window, tracing the steam on the glass as if there was something important out there to study. No one said anything, but I didn't need their words. The silence itself told me more than I wanted to hear. It wrapped around the table like an invisible rope, pulling everyone back from me, leaving me stranded in the center. I reached for the salt, not because the food needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The metal shaker felt cold and foreign in my grip. My appetite was gone, yet I chewed each bite as if I could force normalcy back into the moment. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room seemed louder than the sound of breathing. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower, stretching the quiet into something heavy enough to press on my shoulders. I thought of the times this same table had been alive with noise. Birthdays, holidays, nights when the power went out and we ate by candlelight, laughing at our own shadows on the wall. I had built this table myself, sanding every edge until it was smooth enough for my children's hands. It was supposed to be a place of connection, a place where no one ever felt unwelcome. And yet here I was, sitting in my own chair, tasting the unfamiliar bitterness of being unnecessary. The silence didn't just stay at the table. It followed me in my mind, whispering that my son's words had found a home in the people around me. Maybe they all thought it. Maybe they all had for a while, and he had only been the first to say it out loud. I swallowed hard, not from the food, but from the truth that was settling inside me, that I had given them my best years, and now they saw me as someone whose time had run out. That night the house was quiet, in the way that only comes after a day that has bruised you. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. A sound, an apology, a sign that the air will clear. I moved slowly down the hallway, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet sounding almost reluctant, as though even the wood knew I was carrying something heavier than my steps. The wall on the right was lined with framed photographs, each one a chapter I had helped write. There was the picture from the year we finally bought the house, my arms around my wife, my son on my shoulders, all of us squinting in the sun because we hadn't thought to take the shot in the shade. There was the one from my retirement party, where my coworkers had signed a poster in thick black marker, writing things like, "You kept us going," and "the best foreman we ever had." I remembered the smell of the cake, the sting in my throat when they handed me the watch with my name engraved. Back then I had believed the words "well-earned rest" were a blessing, not a sentence. My fingers trailed along the glass of another frame. My grandson's first day of school, the one where he wore the backpack I had picked out for him, grinning with the gap-toothed smile that only children can wear without self-consciousness. I could still recall the way he had run into my arms after school that day, waving his first spelling test like it was a golden ticket. I stood there, letting my eyes pass over each photograph, and a strange ache built in my chest. In every image I was present, not just in the background, but in the center, building, guiding, holding, protecting. And yet, earlier that evening, I had been made to feel like all of it was sealed in some distant vault labeled the past, as though my usefulness had an expiration date that everyone but me could see. The hallway smelled faintly of the wood polish I used to apply every spring, back when I believed the care you put into a home reflected the care you put into the people in it. But now, each frame felt like a relic of a man they no longer recognized, a man whose worth they had decided was a closed story. I moved on toward the bedroom, the shadows stretching long across the floor, and I couldn't help but feel as if I was walking out of my own history into a present where I no longer quite belonged. A few days passed in a haze that felt both heavy and hollow, the kind of time where every hour blends into the next without leaving a mark. I busied myself with small, unnecessary tasks, reorganizing the garage, oiling the hinges on doors that didn't creak, sweeping the driveway twice in one afternoon. Not because they needed doing, but because I needed to feel like I still had a purpose. It was in the middle of one of those afternoons, with the faint smell of dust and motor oil lingering in the air, that I found the envelope in the mailbox. Thick paper, embossed seal in deep blue, my name printed in deliberate, careful letters across the front. The mayor's office. For a moment, I thought it might be a form letter, a notice about taxes, or a community meeting. But when I tore it open, the weight of the paper inside told me it was something else entirely. The letter was formal, yet warm, inviting me to a ceremony honoring those who had made significant contributions to the community over the years. My name was there, not buried in a list, but standing alone in bold type. They spoke of my decades of service, of rebuilding after the floods, of organizing repair crews when others stayed home, of mentoring young workers who had gone on to lead their own teams. They wrote as if my work had not been forgotten, as if the things I had built still stood tall in more than just memory. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words sink in. There was a quiet swell of something I hadn't felt in a while. Not pride exactly, but a reminder that my life had mattered beyond the walls of my own home. And yet, almost as quickly as it rose, another feeling came in its place. Hesitation. The image of my son's face, the weight of his words, the silence at that table, all of it flickered through my mind. I imagined handing the letter to my family, seeing the polite smiles, the tepid, "That's nice, Dad," before the conversation drifted back to something else. So I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, under a stack of old manuals and spare keys. I didn't tell them, not because I wanted to keep it a secret, but because I wasn't sure it mattered to them anymore. For years I had shared every milestone with my family, believing they would feel the same joy I did. Now, for the first time, I held on to it alone, unsure if their eyes would see it as an honor, or just another relic from a life they thought was over. That night, lying in bed, I could feel the faint outline of the envelope in my mind, as if it was waiting there, patient and silent, for the moment when it would mean more than it did now. But I didn't know if that moment would ever come. The morning of the ceremony broke with a pale, uncertain light that slipped through the blinds like it was afraid to wake the house. I moved quietly, not wanting to explain where I was going, not wanting to hear the indifference in anyone's voice. In the corner of my closet hung the jackets I had worn over the years, each one carrying its own ghosts. There was the heavy wool coat from my working days with frayed cuffs and a stubborn stain near the hem from a winter job site. There was the navy blazer I had worn to my retirement dinner, the one that still held a faint scent of cologne and buttered bread from that night. And there was the newer one, bought but rarely worn, stiff from too much time on the hanger. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them as if the right choice might change how the day would go. My hand hovered over the navy blazer, but as soon as my fingers brushed the fabric, I heard it. My son's voice, sharp and final. "You're just a retired worker now. That's all." It came not like an echo, but like a fresh blow, pulling the air from my chest. Suddenly every jacket looked wrong, every collar too formal, too hopeful, too much for a man they saw as someone who had already lived his useful days. I went to the mirror, holding each one in turn against my shoulders, trying to see which version of myself belonged in it. The reflection staring back at me was lined with years I hadn't noticed stacking up, eyes a little more tired than I remembered, hair thinner at the temples. I thought about not going at all, about folding the invitation back into its envelope and telling myself that such things were for others now. I imagined the hall without me, the speeches going on as planned, the plaque with my name being handed to someone else, to deliver later. It would be easier that way. No risk of disappointment, no chance of standing in a room where I might feel like an intruder in my own story. But then, in the silence, another memory rose. Not of my son, not of the family dinner, but of a younger version of me. The man who had stood in that same mirror decades ago, pulling on a work jacket before sunrise, knowing the day ahead would take everything he had. He had never once stayed home because he doubted himself. He had shown up in storms and heat, in sickness and bone-deep exhaustion. And now, wasn't this just another kind of job? To stand where they asked me to stand, to accept what they thought I'd earned. I took the navy blazer from its hanger and smoothed the fabric with my palms. It didn't erase the doubt, but it felt like the one I should wear, the one that had already seen a room full of people stand for me once before. As I buttoned it, the mirror offered me no reassurance, only a quiet truth. I might not believe in the man wearing it today, but someone out there still did. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to step out the door. The car felt colder than it should have for a late morning. The kind of chill that doesn't come from the weather, but from the absence of voices, from the empty seat beside you. I had left the house without fanfare. No questions, no encouragement, just a half-hearted drive safe from my wife, as she searched her purse for a grocery list. She had errands, she said, and might come by later if she could fit it in. My son had already made his excuse the night before, saying something about a meeting, his tone casual, almost apologetic, though not enough to mask the truth. This wasn't important to him. The road stretched ahead, familiar yet strange, the landmarks blurring past without drawing my attention. I'd driven these streets for years, to job sites, to family picnics, to school events, always with someone in the passenger seat or the back, always with a purpose that felt shared. But today there was only the low hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing, each exhale reminding me that I was the only one making this trip. It felt like a quiet verdict, the kind you don't need a courtroom for. I kept my hands at 10 and 2, the way I had taught my son when he was learning to drive, back when he listened to every word I said as if it were gospel. I remembered his small hands gripping the wheel, the way he'd glance at me for approval after each turn. Somewhere between then and now, the road between us had split, and I hadn't noticed until I was too far behind to catch up. The stoplights seemed longer that day, the weights heavier. At one red light, I glanced at the passenger seat, at the way the sunlight fell across the empty fabric, warming a space no one was using. It wasn't just an empty seat. It was a statement, unspoken but clear. You can go without us, and I was. And I thought about turning around, telling myself the drive was too long, that the ceremony didn't matter. But the truth was, I wasn't turning back because I didn't want to give them that story to tell themselves later. That I hadn't gone because I was too proud or too bitter. I wanted to go, if only to remind myself that I could still walk into a room without someone holding the door for me. As the city buildings began to rise ahead, my grip on the wheel tightened. I tried not to imagine their faces if they had come with me, whether they'd look at me with pride or boredom, or the kind of distracted patience you reserve for something you feel obligated to attend. But no matter how I pictured it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this drive, this empty ride, was the truest reflection of how they saw me now. Not unwelcome, but unnecessary, and that, in its own way, cut deeper than rejection. When I pulled into the parking lot, the rows of cars stretched farther than I expected, their windshields catching the sun in sharp flashes. The low murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter floated out through the open doors of the hall. For a moment I sat in the car, engine off, hands still on the wheel, watching people filter inside in pairs and small groups. They walked with that easy rhythm of belonging, stopping to greet one another, trading smiles that said, "I'm glad you're here." I stayed where I was until the lot began to thin, until the last of the latecomers hurried in, leaving the air outside still. Inside, the smell of polished wood and fresh coffee wrapped around me, mixed with the faint trace of perfume and aftershave from the crowd. The place was fuller than I'd imagined, rows upon rows of chairs, all facing a stage draped in deep blue fabric. Every seat near the front was already taken, the aisles cluttered with coats slung over chairbacks, handbags resting on the floor. I could have asked someone to make room, could have found a way to be seen, but I didn't want to. Recognition wasn't something I craved anymore. It had been too long since it came without a price. I slipped toward the back, moving quietly, trying not to draw attention. A few people glanced my way, polite nods, faint smiles, but no one rose to greet me. The back row offered exactly what I needed, distance. From there, I could be part of the room without becoming part of the moment. The applause, the speeches, the bursts of pride from family members in the crowd, I could watch it all without expectation. From my seat, I could see the stage clearly, but not the finer details of the faces on it. That felt safer somehow. The last time I'd stood before a room with eyes on me had been years ago, at my retirement party. Back then, I'd thought those kinds of moments would keep coming, that there would always be reasons for people to gather and call my name. But sitting in that back row, surrounded by strangers, and the occasional familiar face turned away in conversation, I realized how easily the world forgets the hands that built it. The hum of the crowd swelled as the program began. Names were read, applause rose and fell in steady waves, and I clapped along, even for people I didn't know. It was easier to applaud for others than to think about whether anyone here might clap for me. In that seat, I wasn't the man who had spent decades on call for this community. I was just another figure in the background, another pair of hands politely joining in the noise. And maybe that was all they expected me to be now, quiet, unremarkable, part of the crowd instead of the story. Halfway through the ceremony, the rhythm of the evening felt set. Names, applause, handshakes, photographs, each moment blending into the next. I sat in the back, letting the voices wash over me like background noise, my hands folded loosely in my lap. I was listening without truly hearing, my mind wandering to the drive home, to the quiet house I'd returned to the unopened space at the dinner table that would greet me like it always did. Then it happened. A small shift, almost invisible, broke the flow. The mayor paused mid-sentence as his aide stepped forward, bending slightly to whisper something in his ear. From where I sat, I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the flicker of surprise cross the mayor's face. Not the kind that unsettles, but the kind that carries warmth. His eyes lifted from the notes in front of him, scanning the room slowly, searching, and then he smiled. "I've just been told," he said, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "that we have someone very special here tonight." The room stirred, people glancing around, curious, some craning their necks. The mayor's tone was not rehearsed. It had the freshness of something genuine, something unplanned but important. Someone whose years of dedication helped shape this community in ways that many here benefit from every single day. often without even realizing it. I felt the air around me change, a subtle tightening, as though the rows of chairs themselves were leaning in. My breath caught in my chest, though I didn't yet believe what my instincts were telling me. People in the seats nearby began to glance over their shoulders, their eyes searching in the same slow sweep the mayor had just made. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet, almost fearful thought formed. Could it be me? The mayor kept speaking, his words painting a portrait I recognized but couldn't quite claim in that moment. He worked through storms to restore our roads, mentored young workers who went on to lead teams of their own, and never once asked for recognition in return. Each sentence pulled me a little closer to the truth until there was no denying it. The picture was mine. A strange mixture of emotions surged all at once: disbelief, pride, and something sharper, almost like grief for the years I had convinced myself no one remembered. In the back row, my hands tightened against my knees, the room suddenly brighter, louder, more present. For so long I had sat unnoticed in the spaces I once helped build. Now the spotlight I had stopped expecting was turning toward me. The mayor's gaze landed in my direction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his smile widening, "please join me in welcoming—" And before he even said my name, the applause began. Not polite, not perfunctory, but deep and sustained, rising from every corner of the hall. It was as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for this moment to finally release it. When he finally spoke my name, it didn't sound like it had in my own head all these years, worn down, softened by disuse. It came out full and clear, carrying across the hall with a weight that seemed to add something back to me I hadn't realized was missing. The room reacted instantly. Faces turned in unison, 100 pairs of eyes searching until they found me in the back row. The applause that had started as a polite ripple swelled into something bigger, richer, as if the sound itself wanted to close the distance between where I sat and the stage. For a moment I couldn't move. My hands gripped the sides of my chair, the wood pressing into my palms, grounding me against the surreal pull of the moment. I had learned how to disappear these past few years, how to make myself small in a world that no longer asked for me. And now, without warning, that invisibility was gone. The sudden light of recognition felt both warm and blinding, as though I had stepped from shadow into the center of the sun. People near me shifted in their seats, making space as if they knew I'd have to pass. A woman I didn't recognize smiled and touched my arm lightly, a silent urging for me to go. My legs felt heavy, as if they'd grown roots into the floor. Part of me wanted to stay seated, to let the moment pass and sink back into anonymity, because stepping forward meant opening myself up, to their eyes, to their judgment, to the risk that all of this might be fleeting. And yet, under the noise, under the rush of uncertainty, there was a different sound, faint but steady, the echo of my own name being spoken in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not as a formality, not as a reminder of what I used to be, but as a call. I stood slowly, almost cautiously, feeling the fabric of my blazer stretch across my back. The applause didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder, feeding on itself, filling the hall with a rhythm that seemed to push me forward. My steps at first were careful, uncertain, but each one made the distance between me and the stage a little smaller, the space behind me a little heavier with what I was leaving in that chair. I wasn't prepared for anyone to remember. I wasn't prepared for the sudden, almost painful rush of being seen. But as I moved down the aisle, hands reaching out to clasp mine, heads nodding with recognition, I realized something I hadn't let myself believe in a long time. Maybe I had never truly been forgotten at all. The aisle felt longer than it looked, each step carrying me through a tunnel of faces and hands that reached out as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. People I barely recognized, neighbors I'd only nodded to in passing, men I might have once worked beside decades ago, women who had seen me on job sites in the dead of winter, leaned in to clasp my hand. Some patted my shoulder, their touch firm and deliberate, as though they were trying to transfer something wordless into me. Others simply met my eyes, gave a single nod, and let me pass, their silence carrying a weight no applause could match. The sound in the hall swelled and folded over itself, Not just clapping, but something warmer, almost like an embrace made of noise. It struck me then how long it had been since I'd been met with that kind of respect, not out of obligation, not because of a family title or a holiday gathering, but because people truly remembered what I had done. For years, my worth had been shrinking in the eyes of my own home, my contributions reduced to old stories and photographs. But here, with every hand I shook, every smile I received, the edges of my son's words began to blur. I caught sight of the stage ahead, framed by deep blue curtains, the mayor standing with that same genuine smile, waiting for me to arrive. But I didn't rush. I let the pace be slow, steady, letting each step serve as an answer to that night at the dinner table, when my son had looked me in the eyes and told me I was just a retired worker. The further I walked, the further away that verdict felt. It wasn't erased entirely. Some wounds leave their outline, no matter how much you try to smooth them. But with each passing face that lit up at my approach, it lost a little of its power. About halfway down the aisle, a young man stood to shake my hand. I didn't know him, but his grip was strong, his eyes steady. "You taught my uncle everything he knew about this job," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear over the applause. "He says you saved his life once, out on the site." I nodded, unable to summon words in the moment, but the heat that rose in my chest wasn't shame or anger this time. It was something closer to pride, something I'd thought I'd lost. By the time I reached the front, the noise behind me felt like a tide still pushing forward, carrying me all the way to the first step of the stage. I placed my foot on it, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was intruding where I didn't belong. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not because I demanded it, but because others had called me there. And in that quiet truth, my son's judgment didn't disappear, but it no longer defined the man taking those final steps toward the light. When I reached the center of the stage, the mayor stepped forward and took my hand in both of his. Not in the rushed, polite way politicians often do, but with the steady pressure of someone who understands the weight of the moment. He didn't start speaking right away. Instead, he looked at me for a beat longer than expected, as if he were measuring the years behind my eyes. Then he turned to the microphone, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being heard. But this time it wasn't formality in his tone, it was respect. He began by tracing the years of my work as if he had walked those miles alongside me. He spoke of roads paved under blistering sun, of bridges repaired after storms tore them to pieces, of long nights when floodwaters rose and whole neighborhoods waited in darkness until the crews, my crews, brought the lights back. He spoke of mornings when ice turned the streets into glass, and I'd be out there before dawn, making sure ambulances could pass. His words unfolded like a ledger of effort, each line a memory I hadn't expected anyone to keep. "You didn't just work for a paycheck," he said, pausing as if to let the thought sink in. "You worked for all of us, for every child who walked to school safely because of the sidewalks you rebuilt, for every family who slept through a storm because you made sure their homes stayed warm and lit, for every stranger who never even knew your name but lived in a safer, stronger place because you were here." The applause rose again, but this time I barely heard it. My eyes had drifted across the hall, over the rows of faces, until they caught on the back of the room, and there, half hidden behind a taller man, was my son. I couldn't read his expression from this distance, but I could see he was standing still, his gaze locked on me. For a moment everything else fell away. The mayor's voice, the clapping, the bright lights overhead, until it was just the two of us across a room full of witnesses. The mayor went on, speaking of the kind of service that doesn't make headlines but leaves a town better than it found it. His words didn't exaggerate, but neither did they diminish. They didn't make me larger than life, they made me exactly as I was, a man who had given his working years to something beyond himself. And in hearing it said aloud, I realized how long it had been since I'd thought of my life in those terms. At home, my work had become a set of stories told at best with polite nods, at worst with the unspoken question of why I still clung to them. Here, on this stage, they were not relics. They were proof. When the mayor turned back to me, his hand found my shoulder, And he said softly, so only I could hear, "You've earned this moment." I believed him, not because of the applause still echoing around the hall, but because for the first time in years I could feel the truth of it in my own bones. From the stage, the lights were bright enough to blur the first few rows into a haze, but as my eyes adjusted, shapes became people, and people became faces I knew as well as my own. There was my wife, seated near the middle, her coat still draped over her shoulders, like she had come straight from errands without stopping at home. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but I could see the faintest tremor in her fingers, as though she wasn't sure whether to clasp them tighter or reach out toward me. Beside her sat my grandson, legs swinging just above the floor, his gaze fixed on me with a mixture of pride and confusion, like he was only now realizing that the stories I told him about my work weren't just bedtime filler. They were real, they had happened, and here was a room full of people proving it. And then I saw him, my son, standing in the doorway at the back, half in the light, half in the shadow of the corridor beyond. He was still wearing his work jacket, one hand tucked into his pocket, the other resting awkwardly on the door frame. He looked like a man caught between leaving and staying, but the way his body leaned forward ever so slightly told me he had already chosen. He hadn't planned to come. I knew that without asking. Something had pulled him here. Maybe the sound of my name in someone else's voice. Maybe a call from his mother telling him where she was going. Maybe nothing more than a feeling he couldn't quite shake. But whatever it was, he was here now, and the set of his jaw told me he wouldn't turn away until it was over. Our eyes met across the distance. For a second, he didn't look away. In that stillness, I read things he wasn't ready to say. Questions, maybe even a kind of regret. Not the kind you can patch up with a quick "I'm sorry," but the kind that sits heavy, because it has been years in the making. I wondered if he was thinking about the night at the table, the words he had thrown across it like they were nothing. "You're just a retired worker now, that's all." I wondered if he was hearing them in his own head the way I had heard them in mine ever since, only now against the backdrop of applause and praise from people who had no reason to flatter me. The mayor's voice carried on, naming the projects I had led, the emergencies I had answered, the teams I had trained. But for me, the words were secondary now. My son was in the room. Not because I had asked him, not because anyone had made him come, but because something in him had decided he needed to see this with his own eyes. And in that moment it struck me. Maybe it wasn't just the mayor introducing me to this crowd. Maybe, without knowing it, he was introducing me to my son all over again. When the mayor's words finally came to an end, there was a moment, a heartbeat of stillness, before the applause rose again, as if the room needed to collect itself. He stepped toward me, closing the small space between us, and extended both of his hands. It wasn't the quick clasp you give for photographs. It was deliberate, the kind of handshake that carries weight, meant to convey something more than formality. His grip was warm and steady, and as he looked me in the eye, I felt a quiet affirmation pass between us. Not spoken, but understood. This wasn't just about honoring my past. It was about telling me, in front of everyone, "You still matter." The cameras began to flash, their bursts of light like small cracks of thunder in the otherwise warm hum of the room. I could hear the faint clicks and whirs of lenses adjusting, capturing me mid-smile, mid-shake, mid-breath. I hadn't been on this side of a camera in years. Lately, I'd been the one standing behind it, documenting birthdays or gatherings without ever stepping into the frame myself. Now the light was on me, and it was strange. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, like rediscovering an old photograph you'd forgotten existed. Somewhere beyond the lights, my gaze shifted toward the back of the hall, to where my son still stood. He hadn't moved from the doorway. His posture had changed, though. His shoulders weren't as rigid, his weight had shifted forward, and his head was slightly bowed. But it wasn't shame that lowered his eyes. It was something quieter, heavier. A realization, as if he were piecing together in this very moment the distance between the version of me he'd convinced himself of and the version of me standing here on this stage. I wondered what was running through his mind as the applause washed over us. Was he remembering the winters I'd left before dawn to clear the roads? Or the times I'd missed dinners because the town needed me more than my plate did? Was he hearing the names of the projects I had led and connecting them to the places he still drove past every day? Or was it simpler? Was he just now seeing me through other people's eyes, realizing that their respect for me hadn't faded with my final paycheck? The mayor gave my shoulder a final, firm squeeze before letting go, and I stepped back slightly, allowing the cameras their last few flashes. The applause began to taper off, replaced by a kind of murmuring warmth in the room, people leaning toward one another, exchanging words I couldn't hear but could feel. And in that swell of sound, my son finally lifted his head. Our eyes met again, and though there was still a long way to go between us, I saw something new there. Not pity, not guilt, something closer to truth. When the ceremony ended, the crowd thinned into the cool evening air, their voices spilling into the parking lot in scattered bursts of conversation. I stood near the doors for a moment, still holding the small plaque the mayor had given me, the metal warm where my fingers had gripped it through the speeches and applause. My wife and grandson came up first. She touched my arm briefly. He grinned with a shy kind of pride, and then they moved toward the car. I stayed where I was, unsure if my son would come closer or slip away into the dark. But then he appeared from the edge of the lot, his jacket zipped to the neck, his steps slow but certain. He stopped just in front of me, his eyes skimming the plaque before lifting to my face. There was no long speech, no apology waiting on his tongue. Just a quiet offer that landed heavier than he might have meant it to. Let me drive you home. I hesitated, out of habit more than anything else. For years I had driven myself, to work, to gatherings, to the very edges of exhaustion, because relying on others wasn't something I allowed myself to do. But tonight, something in the way he stood there told me that letting him take the wheel was more than just about the ride. It was about letting him carry even a fraction of what I'd carried for so long. The drive began without music, without the small talk people use to fill space. The headlights cut through the dark, stretching long and pale across the road, and the hum of the engine filled the silence between us. I watched the city lights fade in the side mirror, each one slipping away like a year I'd already lived. My hands rested in my lap, the plaque still there, its weight a reminder of the night's truth. About halfway home at a red light he spoke. His voice was low, almost uncertain, like he wasn't sure the words would come out right. "Dad, I didn't know." That was all. 4 words. But they carried the weight of every misunderstanding, every moment I'd been measured and found wanting in his eyes. They weren't an excuse, and they weren't quite an apology. They were something rarer, an admission. I could have answered. I could have told him all the ways he could have known, if only he'd looked closer. I could have reminded him of the years, the sacrifices, the quiet work that had built the very life he stood on now. But I didn't. Some lessons are better learned in silence, and some truths don't need to be explained to be understood. So I turned my gaze to the windshield, watching the road unwind ahead of us, and let the quiet remain. It wasn't the heavy, cold silence of the dinner table weeks ago. This one was different. It was the kind of silence that leaves space for reflection, for change, and maybe, if we were lucky, for something that might still grow between us. Weeks later, life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Mornings with coffee at the kitchen table, afternoons tending to small repairs around the house, evenings when the sun stretched long shadows across the yard. The ceremony became something that existed quietly in the background, like a song you can still hum but no longer hear on the radio. The plaque from that night sat on the middle shelf of my bookcase, balanced between a framed photo of my grandson's first fishing trip and an old pocket watch from my father. I didn't place it there to be noticed. I placed it there because it belonged in the room where I lived my days, not hidden in a drawer, not hanging on a wall like a trophy. I never pointed it out. I didn't tell guests what it meant or how it came to be in my hands. I didn't even mention it to my son the times he stopped by. I didn't need to. He had been there. He had seen me rise from the back row, walk down the aisle through a sea of hands and faces, and step into the light. He had heard the mayor's words, had seen the respect in the eyes of people who owed me nothing, but still chose to honor me. He had watched me stand there, not as just a retired worker, not as a man whose worth had an expiration date, but as someone whose hands had built roads, whose shoulders had carried responsibility through storms, whose presence had quietly shaped the place we called home. And maybe most importantly, he had seen something else. He had seen that my work had built more than just a town. It had built a family, even if that family had forgotten for a while what it stood on. The bridges I'd repaired weren't just made of steel and concrete. Some of them were made of patience and long hours and sacrifices no one had been awake to witness. That truth no longer needed defending. I didn't need to repeat my history like a man afraid it would vanish if left untold. It stood there, as plain as the plaque itself, as plain as the lines on my hands. In the end, I realized that nothing in my daily life had changed. The same house, the same routines, the same quiet mornings. But something in the air between me and my son was different now. Not fixed, not perfect, but altered in a way that mattered. He looked at me longer now before speaking, listened more carefully, asked questions he might once have brushed aside. The stage that night hadn't rewritten the past, and it hadn't erased the hurt, but it had carved a new place in his understanding, one that couldn't be undone, and for me that was enough. Because some victories don't arrive with fanfare or parades. They arrive in the simple knowledge that the truth, your truth, stands in plain sight, needing no defense, no permission, and no one's approval to exist. It just stands, like you, and endures.